All right, biology students, today we are talking about macromolecules, which could very well be the most important lesson that we get all year. Why do I say that? Because macromolecules is foundational to our understanding of biology. Everything that we learn for the rest of the year is going to relate back to this lesson. So your question might be, what in the world is a macromolecule? And let me start by saying macromolecules sometimes are called macronutrients, sometimes they're called biomolecules. It's just a personal preference, but you'll hear them all different ways. So macronutrients, macromolecules, biomolecules all mean the same thing. I also abbreviate. Sometimes you'll notice in the lesson I call them macros, but just wanted to point that out before we get started. So these biomolecules or macromolecules are molecules that are necessary for every living thing to survive. They're essential sources of energy. They are the means of storing that energy. They are the instructions that all living organisms use to grow and then pass those instructions down to their future generations. So you can see just how important macronutrients and macromolecules are. Now, there are four major biomolecules that we're going to talk about in this lesson, and they are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we're going to go through each one of these, and I'm going to tell you some important things that you need to make sure that you know about each specific macromolecule. Now, before we get started, I do want to write down what a macromolecule is. So a few lessons back, we learned about prefixes and suffixes and root terms that we would learn in biology. And in this lesson, you're going to see why that was so important. So macromolecules, let's start with the prefix macro. If you'll remember, it means large. So a macromolecule is a large molecule that, again, is critically important for all living things. Now, when I say large molecule, I mean in comparison to other molecules. Also, before we jump into the specific macros, I do want to discuss some important vocabulary. So let's start with the word monomer. Again, prefix mono means one, mer means part. So a monomer is one unit of a macromolecule. It is a building block that makes up the four macromolecules that we're going to discuss today. And when you put these monomers together, when you build them together, you get what's called a polymer. So poly means many, mer means part. So a polymer is a strand of many monomers. You can think about it like a necklace, a beaded necklace, where each bead is a monomer. And then when you hook it together, you get the entire necklace, which we call in biology a polymer. And these monomers are bonded by covalent bonds. And I'm not going to get into too much detail there because a lot of you haven't had chemistry yet. So we're just going to leave it at their covalent bonds that bond them. I do want to talk chemistry just a little bit because I feel like this is an essential part of understanding monomers and polymers and macronutrients. So just really quick, when you take monomers, those individual building blocks, and you chemically join them and you get a polymer, this process is called dehydration synthesis. So when you dehydrate something, you remove water from it. So in order to take monomers and make them polymers, we have to remove a molecule of water. And what that does is it creates a covalent bond that holds those polymers together. Now, if we want to do the reverse of that, we want to take a polymer and break it into its individual building blocks or monomers. This process is called hydrolysis. And what happens here is we are actually adding a molecule of water to break that bond, break that covalent bond. Dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis, it's important to note, these are chemical processes, chemical reactions. All right, so now that we've talked about monomers and polymers, just make sure that you know that it's important for you to know that these building blocks, these monomers, comprise these macronutrients that we're about to talk about. We're going to start with carbohydrates, and we're going to work our way through. In your notes, I want you to make sure that you get the elements that comprise these macromolecules. We're also going to talk monomers, so you need to know and make sure you get in your notes the monomer that comprises these carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. what their function is for life, and then get down some examples. All right, so we're going to start with sort of the chemistry part of carbohydrates, the structure of a carbohydrate. So the monomer, remember, of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide. Remember, mono means one, saccharide means sugar. So carbohydrates are made of monosaccharides. A great example of this is glucose. And then when you put two of those monosaccharides together, we have what's called a disaccharide. So disaccharides are made up of two sugars. A good example of this would be sucrose. And then you can have polysaccharides, which are made up of many sugars. So lots of monosaccharides joined together gives us what we call polysaccharide. And polysaccharides are things like starches, which is how plants store sugar. You can have glycogen, which is how animals store sugar. And we're going to talk about both of these when we get to our energetics unit, which is unit 3. You can also have cellulose, which provides structural support in plant cells, and then chitin, which can be found in the cell walls of fungi. So this looks really complicated, I know, but this is the structure, and it's important to understand the structure. More importantly, though, you just need to know that carbohydrates, their main function, and let me go back, their main function is to provide energy for living organisms. Specifically, this is a short-term or fast-acting energy. There are roughly 4 calories per gram of carbohydrates. That's how much energy we get from a gram of carbs. And that number means nothing to you right now, but in just a minute, we're going to use that number to compare lipids and proteins and how much energy they provide living organisms. Just make sure that you know that the monomer of a carbohydrate is a monosaccharide, and the function is to provide fast-acting energy for living organisms and also structure. I did put on the screen that most of your carbohydrates are going to end in OSE. So you have like glucose, sucrose, fructose, cellulose. If you see this picture on a worksheet, test, quiz, I do not want you to be intimidated by this image, but I really want you to understand what we're looking at here structurally from a chemical or molecular standpoint. So what you should notice here when you see this is that we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen as elements that make these molecules. And so immediately you should say, oh, well, that could be a carbohydrate because I know that carbohydrates are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then you can see here that you have 2 of these sugars joined together. So specifically, this is a disaccharide or sucrose, which is what we know as table sugar. Now, foods that are high in carbohydrates are going to be like candy, fruits, pastas, breads. And I feel like society sort of shuns carbohydrates. And of course, everything in moderation, and carbohydrates can potentially cause health problems, but it also would cause health problems if you did not take in carbohydrates because they do help provide energy for cellular processes. All right, so moving on to lipids. Lipids contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. There are some different types of lipids, so triglycerides, which may be a term that you've heard of before. We can have phospholipids, we can have steroids. I do want to point out, you'll notice here I say common parts instead of monomers. There's actually no true monomer for lipids, and this is because they vary in their structure, but they do have glycerols and fatty acids that comprise them. So we're just going to say that glycerol and fatty acids are the monomers of lipids, although that's not entirely correct, but for simplicity's sake, you can think of it that way. Lipids do so much for living organisms in the way of they provide energy storage. Now with carbohydrates, this was a fast-acting energy source. With lipids, this is more of an energy storage for long term. Your body will always use the carbohydrates it has available as energy, but once it depletes those carbohydrates and the glycogen storage, it will tap into the lipid storage for fuel or for energy. Also, you need to know that lipids help to form cell membranes, and they protect our body through insulation and, again, store that fat so that our cells can tap into it if we burn off our carbohydrates. Some examples of lipids would include fats, oils, waxes, and steroids. And I mentioned this with carbohydrates, but remember, carbohydrates provide 4 calories of energy per gram of carbohydrate. With lipids, we actually get 9 calories per gram. So lipids do contain more energy than carbohydrates. An important characteristic to note for lipids is that all lipids are hydrophobic. So again, prefix hydro means water and phobic means fearing. So lipids are water fearing, which means they don't like water. They don't mix well with water. All right, if you'll look at the structure, we mentioned that there's no true monomer for lipids or fats, but fats, also known as triglycerides, do have parts that comprise the triglycerides. So specifically, you can see here we have 1 glycerol and then 3 fatty acids, which is why it's called a triglyceride. And you can see on the screen, this is where we talk about that the function of a lipid or triglyceride is for energy storage. And again, it does provide 9 calories per gram versus the 4 that carbohydrates provide. Now, fats can be saturated, which tend to be solid at room temperature, like butter, and then you can have unsaturated fats, which tend to be liquid at room temperature. And a good example of this would be like olive oil, coconut oil, vegetable oil. I'm not going to elaborate too much on this, but I do want to plant the seed here and just kind of let it grow until we get to Unit 2. So a specific lipid that is really important to cellular function is a phospholipid. So a phospholipid forms the cell membrane of a cell. It is made up of a glycerol, a phosphate group, and then 2 fatty acids. So you can see the 2 tails here on the screen. Those tails are hydrophobic. They do not like water. But the head is hydrophilic, which means it does like water. And you can see how they sort of line up and comprise the cell membrane. Now, we are going to talk about this when we get to the cell, which is Unit 2. We're going to talk about how essential these phospholipids are in helping the cell to maintain homeostasis. But again, I just want to plant this here and let it sort of grow until we get to that unit. All right, some foods that are good sources of lipids and then maybe some that are not so good are oils and fats. And so according to the American Heart Association, olive oil, avocado, and nuts are the best sources of lipids for the human body, for cellular processes. All right, proteins. Now, proteins is going to be the most lengthy part of the lesson, and rightfully so, because proteins are very important molecules that are essential for all living organisms. In fact, by dry weight, proteins are the largest unit of cells. They are involved in virtually all of the cell's functions. So they are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Amino acids comprise proteins, so the monomer is amino acid. And again, the function is a little bit of everything. So we tend to think about proteins in association with muscles, muscle contraction, muscle building, which is true, but proteins do so much more. They help to build the immune system via antibodies. They also act as enzymes. And I'm not sure if we talked about this or not, but enzymes are actually made of proteins. So proteins are important to the body. Proteins are the most diverse macromolecule and the most abundant. And I did not put this on the screen, but I do think it's important to note that there's different types of proteins. So you can have hormonal proteins like insulin that help coordinate certain body functions. You can also have structural proteins like keratin and collagen and elastin. You can have storage proteins that reserve amino acids for the body until the body needs them. And you also have transport proteins, which actually move molecules from one place to another in the body. A great example of this is hemoglobin, which transports oxygen through the blood via red blood cells. So lots of different functions of proteins, lots of different types of proteins. Typically, proteins end in IN, not always, but a lot of the times they do. Now, this is the structure of a protein is very distinguished. In my opinion, it looks like confetti, like a little party, or spaghetti noodles just all wadded up. So you can pretty well distinguish a protein when you see a picture of it. And you can see several examples on the screen. There are 20 common amino acids. Again, amino acids are the monomer that comprise proteins. There are 20 common amino acids that can link together to get these proteins. And when we have a long chain of these amino acids, we call this a polypeptide. And we're going to focus on this a little more in a future unit, but I just want to introduce that vocabulary term to you. So these polypeptides fold and become a protein, which is what you're seeing on the screen. Now we talked about carbohydrates contain 4 calories per gram. And then with lipids, they contain 9 calories per gram. And proteins can also provide the cell with energy. And you actually get the same amount as carbohydrates, 4 calories per gram of proteins. But your body, the human body or the cell, will always tap into the carbohydrates first. It will burn off carbohydrates for an energy source, tap into that glycogen storage for fuel. And then once that's depleted, it'll tap into the lipid storage for energy. And then once that's depleted, as a last resort, the body, if it needs energy, will tap into protein. Here's some foods that are high in protein, and this is nothing new to you. You know, meats, nuts, eggs, beans, great sources of protein. All right, so we're going to end with nucleic acids. So this is our 4th macromolecule. Nucleic acids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. They are made of nucleotides. So nucleotides are the monomers of nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. So if you'll remember from middle school, DNA and RNA is responsible for storing and transmitting instructions to make proteins. Now, when we get to Unit 2, the cell, we're going to learn that the whole existence of the cell is to make proteins. That's the main function of the cell. And so we can see how that's so important here. And that happens through our DNA and RNA and that information that gets transmitted. Now, a nucleotide, you can see that on the screen, is made of 3 parts. So you do need to know sort of the anatomy of a nucleotide. A nucleotide is made up of a sugar. Now, that sugar is different in DNA than it is in RNA. Again, we'll talk about that when we get to Unit 4. But also comprised of a phosphate group, and then you have a nitrogenous base. Now, if we're talking about DNA, you have 4 options for a nitrogenous base. You have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Now, if we're talking about RNA, we have 4 options, but they're a little different. So you have adenine, guanine, cytosine, and then not thymine for RNA, it's replaced with uracil. So let me give you a visual of that. If you look at the picture, you do see on the right the strand of DNA, it's double-stranded versus RNA, which is single-stranded. Again, we're going to get into so much of this in Unit 4, but I'm just planting the seed today. And then you can see with DNA and RNA, they are both comprised or both have options of cytosine for the nitrogenous base, both contain guanine, both contain adenine. DNA does contain thymine, whereas uracil contains, or RNA contains uracil. All right, so feel free to rewind the video if you need to, go back, rewatch, get what you need if you missed anything, and I will see you in the next lesson.